The sound of shattering glass cut through the Sunday morning quiet of the Westchester mansion like a blade. Diana Pierce looked up from her pregnancy book to see her husband Richard standing in the kitchen doorway, his left arm dripping blood onto her pristine white carpet. "Richard, you're bleeding all over my new carpet," Diana said, setting down her book and rising carefully from the leather armchair. At 8 months pregnant, even simple movements required planning. "It's just a scratch, Diana. Stop being so dramatic." Richard's Boston accent clipped each word short, the way it always did when he was irritated. He walked to the kitchen sink, leaving a trail of crimson drops behind him. Diana followed, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. The shattered remains of her favorite coffee mug lay scattered around the kitchen island. She had been drinking from it just minutes before, savoring the quiet morning while Richard worked in his home office. Now the delicate porcelain painted with tiny violets was destroyed, just like so many other small things she had cherished over their 22-year marriage. "How did this happen?" she asked, reaching for the first aid kit they kept in the kitchen drawer. The sound of running water filled the silence as Richard held his arm under the faucet. "I knocked over your mug when I came to get coffee. The damn thing exploded like a bomb." His voice carried that familiar edge of blame, as if somehow the mug's fragility was her fault. Diana opened the white plastic box and pulled out gauze pads and antiseptic. At 50 years old, she had become an expert at tending to small wounds and hurt feelings. The skill had served her well during 2 decades of marriage to Richard Pierce, real estate mogul and owner of Pierce Development Corporation. "Let me see," she said softly, the way she always spoke when trying to smooth over one of Richard's moods. She had learned long ago that gentle tones and careful movements could prevent small storms from becoming hurricanes. Richard extended his arm reluctantly. The gash ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow, deeper than Diana had expected. As she dabbed away the blood with gentle pressure, something caught her eye. Underneath the flowing red, as the skin separated slightly along the wound's edge, she glimpsed something that made her breath catch in her throat. There, revealed by the scratch, was a small, intricate tattoo, delicate script letters that read, "Forever yours S," in elegant black ink. Diana's hands began to shake as she processed what she was seeing. In 22 years of marriage, she thought she knew every inch of Richard's body. She had never seen this tattoo before. The ink looked fresh, the skin around it still slightly inflamed from recent work. "Diana, what are you staring at?" Richard's voice snapped her back to the present. She looked up to meet his dark brown eyes, the same eyes that had charmed her in college, that had promised her the world when he proposed on graduation day. I noticed," she stammered, pointing to the revealed marking. Richard jerked his arm away and rolled down his sleeve in one swift motion. Coffee-colored cashmere covered the evidence of his secret. "It's nothing," he said, his voice taking on the cold tone she had heard more and more frequently over the past year. "Just get me a bandage so I can get to my meeting." "On Sunday morning?" Diana asked, though she immediately regretted the question. Richard did not like to be questioned about his schedule. "Yes, on Sunday morning. Some of us work 7 days a week to maintain this lifestyle." He gestured around the kitchen with its marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. "I have a conference call with the Singapore investors in 20 minutes. Diana applied the bandage with trembling fingers, her mind racing. "Forever yours. S." Who was S? When had Richard gotten a tattoo? Why had he hidden it from her? The questions multiplied in her head like cells dividing, each one more troubling than the last. "There," she said, smoothing the medical tape over the gauze. "That should hold until you can see a doctor if it needs stitches." Richard examined her work with the same critical eye he applied to construction projects. "It's fine. I'll be back late tonight. Don't wait up." He grabbed his coffee mug. His mug, Diana noted, remained intact, and headed toward his office. Diana remained standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the fragments of her favorite cup and the unsettling discovery of her husband's secret tattoo. 22 years of marriage. She had given up her teaching career when they decided to try for children. She had endured 3 miscarriages and years of fertility treatments. She had supported Richard through the early days of his business, when money was tight and stress ran high. She had been the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties and charity events, always smiling, always supportive. Now, finally pregnant again at 50, after years of hoping, she thought their life was complete. The nursery was painted soft yellow, neither pink nor blue because they wanted to be surprised. Tiny clothes hung in the closet. A crib waited in the corner, the same style they had bought 19 years ago for the baby they lost at 6 months. But now, staring at the bloody gauze in her hands, Diana realized she might not know the man she had spent half her life with at all. The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty house. Richard's BMW roared to life in the circular driveway, and then silence settled over the mansion like dust. Diana sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. The baby kicked, as if responding to her mother's distress. "What kind of world am I bringing you into?" "Little one," she whispered to her unborn child. Outside, the October sun climbed higher, but inside the Pierce mansion, Diana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. Diana's phone buzzed against the granite countertop, the vibration unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. She glanced at the screen. Maureen Kelly, her college roommate and closest friend, the one person who knew her before she became Mrs. Richard Pierce. "Hey, Maureen," Diana answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Honey, you sound terrible. What's wrong?" Maureen's thick New Jersey accent carried through the phone like a warm hug. Even after 30 years, she could read Diana's moods from the smallest vocal cues. Diana explained the morning's events, her voice shaking as she described the hidden tattoo. Maureen listened without interruption, the way good friends do when crisis calls. "Diana, sweetie, men don't get secret tattoos at 55 unless something big is happening," Maureen said when Diana finished. "Especially not romantic tattoos with someone's initial. That's not midlife crisis behavior. That's affair behavior." The word hung in the air between them. Affair. Diana had never allowed herself to think it directly, though the signs had been accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon. "You think I'm being paranoid?" Diana said, though it was more question than statement. "Honey, when has your instinct ever been wrong? Remember senior year when you knew something was off about that guy I was dating? You were right about the gambling problem. Remember when you sensed something weird about the contractor Richard hired for the pool house? You were right about him overcharging." Maureen's voice gained strength with each example. "Your gut doesn't lie. Diana, it's your head that talks you out of trusting it." Diana walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the perfectly manicured grounds. Richard had hired a team of landscapers to maintain their 3-acre property. Every hedge was trimmed to geometric precision, every flower bed arranged by color and height. It was beautiful and lifeless, like a magazine photograph. "Tell me what else has been different," Maureen said. "Start from the beginning." Diana thought back over the past year, incidents she had dismissed or rationalized suddenly taking on new significance. "He's been working later, much later, and he takes calls in other rooms now, always closing the door. What else? New cologne. He says his old one was discontinued, but I saw bottles of the old brand at the department store last week." Diana's voice grew stronger as she cataloged the evidence. "He bought new clothes without me. Richard has never shopped alone in all the years I've known him." "What about the physical stuff?" Maureen asked gently. "You know what I mean." Diana flushed, even though she was alone. "We haven't, not since the second trimester started. He says he's worried about hurting the baby, but with our other pregnancies, he was always very attentive. The man who couldn't keep his hands off you for 20 years is suddenly worried about pregnancy sex." Maureen's skepticism was evident. "Diana, you're 8 months pregnant, not made of glass." Through the window, Diana watched a red cardinal land on the bird feeder Richard had installed for her birthday 3 years ago. The bright flash of color against the autumn landscape reminded her of something she had been trying not to think about. "There's something else," she said quietly. Money? He's been more secretive about finances. He used to show me everything. Investments, business deals, even the household accounts. Now he says I don't need to worry about such things, that I should focus on the baby. Since when does Richard Pierce think his wife shouldn't worry about money? Maureen's voice sharpened. That man has involved you in every financial decision since you got married. He used to call you his secret weapon because you caught details he missed. It was true. Diana had a head for numbers and a careful eye for details. In the early years of Pierce's development, she had essentially functioned as Richard's unpaid accountant and business advisor. She had reviewed contracts, caught errors that could have cost thousands, and helped him navigate complex deals. He had often credited her insights with saving or making significant money. When did he start excluding you from the financial stuff? Maureen asked. Diana calculated in her head. About 8 months ago, right around the time I got pregnant. The silence on the phone line was heavy with implication. 8 months. The same time frame as Richard's behavior changes. His late nights. His secrecy. And if Maureen was right about the tattoo being fresh, it all aligned with disturbing precision. Diana, I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear me without getting defensive, Maureen said. I think Richard is having an affair, and I think he's been planning something for a while. Men like Richard don't just have flings, they plan exit strategies. Diana sank into the kitchen chair, the weight of pregnancy and realization pressing down on her simultaneously. But why now? We're finally having the baby we've wanted for so long. Everything should be perfect. Honey, when did you first start trying to get pregnant again? About 1.5 years ago? When I turned 49, we decided to try one more time before it was too late. And when did Richard start acting different? Diana did the math, her mind working with the clarity that came when emotions stepped aside for logic. The fertility treatments started working about 10 months ago. We confirmed the pregnancy 8 months ago. Right when he started excluding you from finances and working late, Maureen finished. Diana, I think Richard got you pregnant to keep you busy and dependent while he set up his exit plan. The words hit Diana like cold water. She thought about all the times Richard had encouraged her to rest, to stop worrying about business matters, to focus entirely on the pregnancy. She had thought he was being protective. Now she wondered if he had been isolating her. But that's so calculated, she whispered. So cruel. Narcissistic abuse often is, Maureen said gently. It's not about emotion or impulse. It's about control and self-interest. Diana had never applied those words to her marriage before, but they settled into her consciousness with uncomfortable familiarity. Richard did control most aspects of their life together. He decided where they lived, how they spent money, who they socialized with, even what television shows they watched. She had always seen it as him being decisive, taking care of details so she didn't have to worry. Now she wondered if she had been systematically isolated from her own life. What should I do? She asked. First, you need to find out for sure what's going on. Do you have access to his computer, his phone, his office? Diana considered the question. His office is locked when he's not home, and he carries his phone everywhere. But he leaves his laptop in the kitchen sometimes when he's taking calls. Start there. But Diana, be careful. Don't let him know you're investigating, and don't confront him until you have solid evidence and a plan. A plan for what? For protecting yourself and your baby. If I'm right about this, Richard isn't going to make it easy for you. Men like him never do. After Maureen hung up, Diana sat in the kitchen staring at the fragments of her coffee mug, which she still hadn't cleaned up. The broken pieces caught the light, sharp edges glinting with reflected sunshine. She thought about financial independence, something she hadn't considered in 20 years. She thought about single motherhood at 50. She thought about starting over with a newborn baby and no career to return to. But mostly, she thought about that tattoo, Forever Yours, S. Someone had claimed her husband's loyalty with enough certainty to mark it permanently on his skin. Someone who wasn't her, despite 22 years of marriage and decades of devotion. Diana heaved herself up from the chair and walked to Richard's side of the kitchen, where he kept his laptop charging station. The computer was gone, of course. He had taken it to his mysterious Sunday morning meeting, but his desk calendar was still there. The leather-bound planner he used to track appointments and meetings. Diana had bought it for him 5 years ago for Christmas, and he wrote in it religiously with the Mont Blanc pen she had given him for their anniversary. She opened it to the current week and began to read. Thursday, 7 p.m. dinner meeting. Scarlet Friday. 9 p.m. property review. Saturday. 2 p.m. site visit. Scarlet. SS. The same initial from the tattoo, repeated throughout his schedule like a code. Diana flipped back through several weeks of entries. The pattern was clear once she knew what to look for. Richard had been meeting with his Scarlet person regularly for months, and he had been disguising the meetings as business appointments. She found Richard's business card file and rifled through it until she found what she was looking for. Scarlett Stevens, property manager. The card listed her as working for Pierce Development Corporation. Diana had never heard of any Scarlett Stevens, and she knew all of Richard's employees. Pierce Development was not a large company. Richard preferred to keep operations small and personal, claiming it allowed for better quality control. Every property manager, construction supervisor, and office worker had been to their house for company parties over the years, except Scarlett Stevens. Diana photographed the business card with her phone, then returned everything to its original position. She was learning to think like an investigator, to gather evidence without leaving traces of her search. The baby kicked sharply, as if responding to Diana's elevated heart rate. She placed both hands on her belly and took deep breaths, trying to calm herself for the sake of her unborn child. "It's okay, little one," she whispered. "Mama's going to figure this out." But as she stood in the kitchen of the house that suddenly felt more like a prison than a home, Diana wondered if she had the strength to handle whatever truth she was going to uncover. Outside, the red cardinal returned to the bird feeder, its bright presence a small spot of courage in an increasingly dark landscape. The sound of Richard's key in the front door at nearly midnight made Diana's heart race. She had spent the day in emotional turmoil, alternating between fury and self-doubt, but she had made a decision. Tonight, she would confront him with what she had found. She had arranged the evidence carefully on the coffee table in the living room, printed copies of credit card statements she had retrieved from their shared email account, the business card for Scarlett Stevens, and photographs of the mysterious appointments in his calendar. The papers were spread out like exhibits in a courtroom, which was exactly how Diana felt, like she was about to present a case. "Diana," Richard's voice called from the foyer, "why are all the lights on?" "In here," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard appeared in the living room doorway, still wearing his expensive charcoal suit and silk tie. He looked every inch the successful businessman, which made what Diana was about to do feel even more surreal. This was her husband of 22 years, the father of her unborn child, the man she had built her entire adult life around. His eyes immediately fell on the papers spread across the coffee table, and Diana watched his expression change from tired annoyance to sharp alertness. "What the hell is this? Diana." She had rehearsed this moment all day, practiced her words and anticipated his responses. But now, faced with his actual presence and his immediate anger, her carefully planned speech scattered like leaves in the wind. "I could ask you the same thing about these restaurant bills," she said, pointing to the credit card statements. "Chez Laurent, Le Bernardin, Daniel, some of the most expensive restaurants in the city, and I've never been to any of them with you." Richard's face flushed red, the color creeping up from his collar like rising water. "You went through my private papers." His immediate response told Diana everything she needed to know. Not denial, not explanation. Outrage at being caught. "Our papers? Richard? Joint credit cards? Joint accounts? Our marriage?" Diana stood up as much as her pregnant belly would allow, trying to reclaim some physical authority in the conversation. "Who is Scarlett Stevens?" "You have no right to go through my business documents," Richard said. his voice rising. He stepped into the room but remained near the doorway, as if preparing for either attack or retreat. I work 80 hours a week to keep you in this house, to pay for your clothes and your spa appointments and your organic groceries. This is how you repay me, by spying on me like some paranoid housewife. The words hit Diana like physical blows. Paranoid housewife, as if her suspicions were symptoms of mental illness rather than reasonable responses to actual evidence. Richard, I found your calendar. I found the business card. I know you've been meeting with this woman for months. Diana's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fed by righteous anger. Just tell me the truth. The truth, Richard laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. The truth is that you're 8 months pregnant and losing your mind. Pregnancy hormones are making you paranoid and irrational. There it was, the gaslighting that Maureen had warned her about, making her question her own sanity rather than addressing her legitimate concerns. Then explain the tattoo, Diana said quietly. Explain forever yours. S. Richard's face went pale, and for a moment he was silent. Diana could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much she knew and how much he could lie his way out of. That's nothing, he said finally. A stupid mistake from a business trip. Too much to drink with clients. It doesn't mean anything. You got a romantic tattoo because you were drunk with business clients. Diana's voice carried more skepticism than she had ever directed at her husband before. Yes, that's exactly what happened. Richard stepped closer, and Diana instinctively backed toward the couch. Diana, you're creating problems where none exist. You're imagining conspiracies and affairs because you're scared about becoming a mother again at 50. He was using her own fears against her, the fears she had confided to him during quiet moments in their bedroom. The fear that she was too old, that something would go wrong with the pregnancy, that she wouldn't be a good mother after so many years of trying and failing. I'm not imagining $1,500 dinners at restaurants I've never been to, Diana said, but her voice was less certain now. Richard's confidence was overwhelming, his ability to make her doubt her own perceptions. Those are business dinners. Diana, client entertainment, part of keeping the company profitable so we can afford this lifestyle. He gestured around the room with its Persian rugs and original artwork. Scarlett Stevens is a property manager who works for me. I meet with all my employees. There's nothing unusual about that. Why haven't I met her? I know all your other employees. Because you've been focused on the pregnancy, as you should be. I've been handling more of the business operations myself to keep stress away from you. Richard's voice softened, taking on the caring tone she remembered from earlier years. Diana, I'm worried about you. This paranoia isn't healthy for you or the baby. Diana felt her certainty crumbling under the weight of his explanations. Richard was a successful businessman. He did have client dinners. He did hire new employees. And she had been more isolated during this pregnancy, more focused on her health and the baby's development. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe pregnancy hormones were affecting her judgment. Maybe she was creating problems because she was scared of becoming a mother at 50. I'm sorry, she heard herself saying. When I saw the tattoo and then the restaurant bills, I should have told you about the tattoo, Richard said, sitting down on the couch beside her. I was embarrassed. It was such a stupid thing to do, getting drunk and letting some random tattoo artist talk me into it. I was going to have it removed before you saw it. His hand found hers and squeezed gently. The familiar gesture reminded Diana of thousands of other moments of connection over their marriage. Richard could be demanding and controlling, but he had also been her partner for more than 2 decades. He had held her through 3 miscarriages. He had supported her dream of having children even when fertility treatments became expensive and emotionally draining. The S doesn't stand for anything, he continued. The tattoo artist said it stood for success, for strength. I was drunk enough to think that sounded profound. Diana wanted to believe him. It would be so much easier to believe him, to return to the comfortable routine of their marriage, to focus on preparing for their baby's arrival instead of investigating her husband's faithfulness. And Scarlett Stevens is just an employee, a very professional property manager who's been helping us acquire several new developments. Nothing more. Sakura. Richard's thumb stroked across her knuckles, the same gesture he had used to comfort her since their college days. Diana looked down at the papers scattered across the coffee table. Evidence that had seemed so damning an hour ago, but now felt like the product of an overactive imagination and pregnancy anxiety. "I'm sorry I went through your things," she said quietly. "I just got scared when I saw that tattoo, and then my mind started running away with me." "It's okay," Richard said, pulling her closer. "Pregnancy is scary, especially at our age. It's natural to feel anxious and suspicious. But Diana, you have to promise me you won't do this again. This kind of stress isn't good for you or the baby." Diana nodded, feeling foolish and ashamed. Of course, Richard was right. She was 50 years old and 8 months pregnant with their miracle baby. She should be focusing on preparing for motherhood, not creating marital drama out of thin air. "Why don't you go get some rest?" Richard suggested. "I'll clean up these papers and come to bed in a few minutes." Diana kissed him goodnight and made her way upstairs to their bedroom, her body feeling heavy with more than just pregnancy weight. In the bathroom, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, hair disheveled, face puffy from crying, maternity nightgown stretched tight over her enormous belly. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe she was just a paranoid housewife, seeing threats where none existed. But as she brushed her teeth and prepared for bed, one thought kept nagging at her if the tattoo really was just a drunken mistake. Why had Richard's face gone so pale when she mentioned it? And why, if Scarlett Stevens was just a professional employee, did Richard meet with her so often outside normal business hours? Diana climbed into bed and tried to quiet her racing mind, but sleep was slow to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that tattoo, "Forever Yours, S." In the morning, she told herself, she would put these foolish suspicions aside and focus on what really mattered, preparing for their baby's arrival. She would be the supportive wife Richard needed and deserved. But deep in her heart, beneath the self-doubt and shame, a small voice whispered that she had been right to be suspicious, and that giving up now might be the biggest mistake of her life. 3 days passed in uneasy normalcy. Diana threw herself into preparing the nursery, organizing baby clothes and researching pediatricians. She tried to push away the lingering doubts about Richard's explanation, focusing instead on the growing excitement of meeting their child. Richard seemed to make an effort too. He came home earlier 2 nights in a row, brought Diana flowers, and spent time talking about baby names and parenting plans. It felt like a return to the intimacy they had shared earlier in the pregnancy, before doubt had crept into their marriage. On Wednesday night, Diana fell asleep on the couch while reading a book about infant sleep schedules. She woke around 2 in the morning to the sound of Richard's phone ringing on the coffee table beside her. He had left it there while going upstairs to change clothes, and in her groggy state, Diana automatically reached for it. "Hello," she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Richard, baby, when are you leaving her?" The voice was sultry and young, with a slight southern accent that immediately made Diana wide awake. There was an intimacy in the tone, a familiarity that spoke of ongoing relationship rather than business communication. Diana's sharp intake of breath must have been audible because the voice continued. "Richard, are you there? You sound different." Diana's heart hammered against her ribs as she struggled to find words. The baby kicked violently, as if responding to her mother's sudden stress. "Richard," the voice asked again, now sounding uncertain. Diana hung up without speaking. She stared at the phone in her shaking hands, her mind racing. When are you leaving her? The question implied an ongoing conversation about Richard ending their marriage. It suggested planning, conspiracy, a future that didn't include Diana. Footsteps on the stairs made her quickly place the phone back where Richard had left it. She closed her eyes and tried to regulate her breathing, pretending to be asleep when Richard appeared in the living room. "Diana," he whispered, "you fell asleep reading again." She made a show of waking up slowly, stretching and rubbing her eyes. "What time is it?" "After 2. Come on, let's get you to bed properly." Richard helped her up from the couch, his hands gentle on her arms. Diana searched his face for signs of guilt or anxiety, but he seemed normal, concerned only with her comfort. "Did your phone ring?" she asked carefully. "I thought I heard something." "Probably a wrong number," Richard said dismissively. "You know how it is with international business calls. Time zones get confusing." International business calls at 2 in the morning, Diana filed the excuse away with all the other small lies she was beginning to recognize. In bed, she lay awake listening to Richard's breathing. He fell asleep quickly, the way he always did. While Diana's mind churned with new questions, the voice on the phone had been young, seductive, familiar with Richard's personal life. It hadn't sounded like a business associate discussing property management. "When are you leaving her?" The question echoed in Diana's head until dawn. The next morning, Richard was unusually attentive at breakfast, asking about her doctor's appointment later in the week and discussing plans for the weekend. But Diana noticed he kept his phone close, checking it frequently. After he left for work, Diana called Maureen. "She asked when he was leaving me," Diana said without preamble when her friend answered. "A woman called his phone at 2 in the morning and asked when he was leaving me." "Oh, honey," Maureen breathed. "Are you sure that's what she said?" Diana recounted the conversation word for word, her voice shaking as she relived the moment of realization. "That's not an affair, Diana. That's an exit strategy," Maureen said grimly. "She's not just sleeping with your husband. She's expecting him to divorce you and be with her." The words confirmed Diana's worst fears, but hearing them spoken aloud made them real in a way that felt devastating. "What do I do?" Diana whispered. "You get evidence, and you get a lawyer. In that order. Diana, you cannot confront Richard about this until you have protection in place. If he's planning to leave you, he's probably been moving assets around, protecting his money." Diana thought about Richard's recent secrecy about finances, his exclusion of her from business decisions. "You think he's hiding money? I think rich men don't leave marriages without protecting their wealth first. And Diana, you need to think about the timing. You're 8 months pregnant. If Richard's planning to leave, he might wait until after the baby is born so he can claim you're an unfit mother." The possibility hit Diana like a physical blow. Richard using her pregnancy against her, claiming she was unstable or incapable. In her current emotional state, fighting a nasty custody battle while dealing with a newborn, she might actually appear unstable to a court. "I need proof," Diana said, her voice growing stronger. "Real evidence, not just suspicious phone calls and secret tattoos. Can you get into his computer?" His phone. Diana considered the logistics. Richard was careful with his devices, but not paranoid. Maybe. He sometimes leaves his laptop open when he's taking shower or making breakfast. "Be careful. Don't leave any traces that you've been snooping." And Diana start documenting everything. Dates, times, conversations, anything unusual. If this goes to court, you'll need a paper trail. After the call, Diana began keeping a journal, recording Richard's schedule, his moods, his explanations for late nights and weekend meetings. She documented the mysterious phone call, the tattoo discovery, the business card for Scarlett Stevens. Writing it all down made the pattern undeniable. Richard was not just having an affair, he was planning to end their marriage, and he was doing it with calculated precision. That evening, Richard came home with takeout from Diana's favorite Thai restaurant, an unusual gesture that immediately made her suspicious. "Thought you might be too tired to cook," he said, unpacking containers of pad thai and green curry. "That's very thoughtful," Diana said, watching his face carefully. "How was your day? Busy?" "Lots of meetings about the new development project." Richard avoided her eyes as he spoke, focusing on arranging the food on plates. "The one Scarlett Stevens is managing." Richard's hand paused for just a moment before continuing to spoon curry onto his plate. "Among others, she's been very helpful with the zoning issues." Diana filed away his response, still claiming Scarlett was just an employee, but the slight hesitation suggested otherwise. During dinner, Richard's phone buzzed repeatedly with text messages. Each time, he glanced at the screen and then at Diana, clearly wanting to read the messages but not wanting to appear rude. "Go ahead and check your messages," Diana said. "I know business doesn't stop for dinner." "It can wait," Richard said, but his eyes kept drifting to the phone. After dinner, Richard excused himself to make some calls, closing himself in his office as he had every night for months. Diana cleaned the kitchen and prepared for bed, but her mind was working furiously. She needed to see those text messages. She needed to know who was contacting her husband so urgently, and what they were saying that was so important it couldn't wait through dinner. As she lay in bed waiting for Richard to finish his calls, Diana made a decision. Tomorrow, when Richard was at work, she would find a way to access his computer or his phone records. She would get the evidence she needed to understand what was really happening to her marriage. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mother's determination. Diana placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "Don't worry, little one. Mama's going to protect us both." Outside their bedroom window, the October wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the last of the autumn leaves and leaving the branches bare and exposed. Just like Diana's marriage, all the beautiful decorations were falling away, revealing the stark truth underneath. Diana's hands shook as she started her car in the parking lot of the nondescript office building in White Plains. She had never thought she would find herself hiring a private investigator to spy on her own husband. But the phone call had changed everything. She needed professional help to uncover the truth about Richard's secret life. The GPS voice guided her through unfamiliar streets as she drove toward the address Maureen had given her. Frank Morrison came highly recommended by Maureen's divorce attorney from her own marriage dissolution 5 years earlier. According to Maureen, Frank was thorough, discreet, and specialized in cases involving wealthy spouses who thought they were untouchable. The building was older brick construction, the kind of place that housed accountants and insurance agents rather than glamorous private detectives. Diana found Frank's office on the third floor, wedged between a tax preparation service and a notary public. The waiting area smelled of coffee and old leather, furnished with mismatched chairs and outdated magazines. Diana had imagined something more dramatic, more like the detective shows Richard liked to watch. Instead, it felt like visiting her family doctor. Mrs. Pierce. A man in his 60s emerged from an inner office, extending his hand in greeting. Frank Morrison was tall and lean, with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen everything and been surprised by very little. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Diana said, accepting his handshake. His grip was firm and steady, which she found oddly reassuring. "Come on back. Can I get you some coffee water?" Diana declined and followed him into his office. The room was cramped but organized, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a desk covered in neat stacks of paperwork. Framed licenses and certifications hung beside a window that looked out over the parking lot. "So," Frank said, settling into his chair, "Maureen Kelly tells me you might need some help with a domestic situation." Diana had rehearsed this conversation during the drive, but sitting across from Frank Morrison made it real in a way that felt overwhelming. She was about to hire someone to investigate the man she had shared a bed with for 22 years. "I think my husband is having an affair," she said quietly. "I need to know for certain." Frank pulled out a yellow legal pad and uncapped a pen. "Tell me what's been going on." Diana began with the tattoo discovery and worked her way through Richard's behavior changes, the mysterious phone call, and the business card for Scarlett Stevens. Frank took notes without judgment, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly just listening. "How long have you been married?" he asked when she finished. 22 years. We met in college. Got married right after graduation. Children. I'm 8 months pregnant with our first child." Diana's hand moved instinctively to her belly. "We tried for years, had several miscarriages. This pregnancy it's everything we've wanted." Frank's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Pierce, I have to ask this directly. Are you prepared for what I might find? Sometimes the truth is harder to handle than the uncertainty." Diana considered the question. Was she prepared to learn that her marriage was over, that the father of her unborn child was planning to leave them both, that 22 years of shared history meant nothing to Richard. "I need to know," she said finally. "Whatever the truth is, I need to know so I can protect my baby and myself." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good. That's the right attitude. Now, let me explain how this works." He outlined his process: surveillance, financial record searches, background checks, documentation of meetings and activities. Everything would be thoroughly documented with photographs, timestamps, and detailed reports that would hold up in court if necessary. "The retainer is $5,000, Frank said. "That covers the first week of investigation. Depending on what we find, we might need more time." Diana's stomach clenched. $5,000 was more money than she had spent on herself in months. Richard controlled their finances so completely that she would have to withdraw the money from their joint savings account, an action he would certainly notice. "Is there a problem with the fee?" Frank asked, reading her hesitation correctly. "My husband manages all our finances. He'll see the withdrawal. Can you get the money without him knowing? Do you have access to accounts he doesn't monitor?" Diana shook her head. Richard had convinced her years ago that consolidating their finances was more efficient. All their accounts were joint. All their credit cards required both signatures for major purchases. She had no independent access to money. "This is more common than you might think," Frank said gently. "Financial control is often part of the pattern in these situations. Can you borrow the money from a friend or family member?" Diana thought about calling her parents, but they were in their 70s and living on a fixed income. Her sister lived in California and had her own family to support. Maureen would lend her the money in a heartbeat, but Diana hated the thought of involving her friend so deeply in her marital problems. "I'll figure it out," she said. "What else do you need from me?" Frank handed her a contract to review and sign, explaining the terms and confidentiality agreements. Everything would be handled discreetly, with reports delivered to Diana at locations and times that wouldn't raise Richard's suspicions. "One more thing," Frank said as Diana prepared to leave. "Don't change your behavior at home. Don't confront your husband or let on that you suspect anything. If he realizes you're investigating him, he'll become more careful, and my job becomes much harder." Diana nodded, though the instruction felt impossible. How could she continue to share a bed and breakfast table with Richard while knowing what she suspected? How could she smile and make conversation while wondering if every word was a lie? "I know it's difficult," Frank said, recognizing her struggle, "but think of it as protecting your investigation. The more normal you act, the more likely we are to get the evidence you need." Diana signed the contract and shook Frank's hand again. "How long before you have something to report?" "Give me a week. I'll start with basic surveillance and background checks on this Scarlett Stevens. If your husband is having an affair, I'll find proof." As Diana drove home, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. For the first time in months, she was taking action instead of just worrying. She was no longer the passive victim of whatever Richard was planning. The hardest part would be getting the money for Frank's retainer. Diana considered her options as she navigated traffic back to Westchester. She could sell some jewelry, but Richard would notice if valuable pieces went missing. She could take a cash advance on one of their credit cards, but that would show up on their monthly statements. Finally, she remembered the emergency fund Richard had insisted they maintain. $10,000 in cash kept in their bedroom safe for catastrophic situations. Richard had given her the combination years ago and never changed it, probably forgetting she had access. If discovering that her husband was planning to abandon his pregnant wife wasn't a catastrophic situation, Diana couldn't imagine what would qualify. That evening, while Richard was in his office making his nightly phone calls, Diana retrieved the money from their safe. Her hands trembled as she counted out $100 bills, but her resolve was steady. Tomorrow, she would deliver the retainer to Frank Morrison and begin the process of uncovering the truth about her marriage. Whatever that truth turned out to be, at least she would face it with her eyes open. As she tucked the money into her purse, the baby kicked strongly, as if approving of her mother's newfound courage. We're going to be okay, little one, Diana whispered. Whatever happens, we're going to be okay. 2 weeks of waiting felt like 2 years. Diana went through the motions of normal life. Doctor's appointments, grocery shopping, preparing the nursery, while her mind constantly wondered what Frank Morrison was discovering about her husband's secret activities. Richard seemed oblivious to her internal turmoil, which was either a testament to her acting ability or proof of how disconnected they had become. He continued his pattern of late nights and mysterious meetings, always with plausible explanations that Diana now recognized as carefully constructed lies. Finally, Frank called. Mrs. Pierce, I have the report ready. Can you meet me this afternoon? Diana's heart raced. Is it what we suspected? I'd rather discuss the details in person. Can you come to the coffee shop on Main Street in White Plains? Say 3 o'clock. Diana agreed and spent the intervening hours in nervous anticipation. By the time she arrived at the coffee shop, her hands were shaking and her stomach was churning with more than pregnancy-related nausea. Frank was already seated at a corner table, a manila envelope placed beside his coffee cup. He stood when Diana approached, pulling out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy. How are you feeling? He asked as she settled herself awkwardly into the seat. Terrified, Diana admitted. But I need to know. Frank studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Mrs. Pierce, this is going to be hard to see. Are you sure you're ready? Diana placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby's reassuring movement. I'm ready. Frank opened the envelope and withdrew a stack of photographs. I'll start with the surveillance photos and then move to the financial information. The first photograph showed Richard and a stunning young woman walking hand in hand into an upscale restaurant. The woman was tall and slender with red hair, probably in her late 20s. Even in the grainy surveillance photo, her beauty was obvious. This is Scarlett Stevens, Frank said. 28 years old, originally from Atlanta. She's been living in New York for about a year. Diana stared at the photo, feeling oddly detached from her own emotions. Here was visual proof of her husband's infidelity, but it felt surreal, like looking at strangers rather than her life. Frank showed her more photos, Richard and Scarlett entering a hotel, kissing in the parking lot of a restaurant, Richard carrying flowers to the door of an apartment building. This is her apartment in Stamford, Frank explained. Your husband visits regularly, usually on weekday evenings and weekend afternoons. Diana studied Scarlett's face in the photographs. She was young and beautiful. Everything Diana felt she was not at 50 and 8 months pregnant. But more than that, she looked happy. In every photo, Scarlett was smiling, laughing, gazing at Richard with obvious adoration. There's more, Frank said gently, producing another set of documents. Financial records, property transfers, corporate filings. Diana's hands shook as she read through the papers. Richard had been systematically moving money out of their joint accounts and into accounts accessible only to him. He had purchased the apartment where Scarlett lived, listing it as a corporate property for Pierce Development. He had bought her a car, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, all paid for with money that Diana had assumed was being saved for their child's future. How much? Diana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Approximately $200,000 over the past 8 months, Frank said. Maybe more that I haven't tracked down yet. $200,000. Diana tried to process the number. That was money from their savings, their investments, their carefully planned financial future. Richard had spent it all on his mistress while telling Diana they needed to be careful with expenses because of the baby. There's something else, Frank said, his voice growing even more gentle. Something you need to know about the timeline. He showed her a medical report he had somehow obtained. Scarlett Stevens is pregnant. Mrs. Pierce, about 6 months along. The words hit Diana like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table as the coffee shop seemed to spin around her. 6 months, she repeated numbly. Which means she got pregnant in April, right around the time your husband found out you were having a boy. Diana remembered that day clearly. the ultrasound appointment where they had learned their baby's gender, Richard's seeming joy at the news, their celebration dinner at their favorite restaurant, while she had been glowing with happiness about their miracle pregnancy. Richard had been sleeping with another woman. "Mrs. Pierce, are you all right?" Frank's concerned voice seemed to come from very far away. Diana ran to the coffee shop bathroom and vomited until her stomach was empty. When she returned to the table, Frank had ordered her a glass of water and was looking at her with professional sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said, sinking back into her chair. "I just need a minute to process this. Take all the time you need." Diana sipped the water and tried to organize her thoughts. Richard was having an affair. The other woman was pregnant with his child. He had spent their savings on her. He was planning to leave Diana. The phone call she had overheard proved that. "What else?" she asked. "What else do I need to know?" Frank hesitated. "There are some text messages, emails, phone records. I'm not sure you want to see those right now." "Show me." The electronic communications were devastating in their intimacy and cruelty. Richard calling Scarlett "my love" and "my future," while referring to Diana as "my obligation" and "the old wife." Plans for their life together after he divorced Diana. Discussions of how to minimize his financial obligations to Diana and their child. The worst was a text exchange from the previous week. "Richard, Diana's getting suspicious. We need to be more careful." "Scarlett, I can't wait much longer." "Baby, and when are you going to tell her?" "Richard, after the kid is born, she'll be too overwhelmed to fight back." "Scarlett, what if she doesn't give you a divorce?" "Richard, she will. She's completely dependent on me. Where else is she going to go with a newborn baby and no job?" Diana read the exchange 3 times before the full cruelty sank in. Richard wasn't just planning to leave her. He was planning to use her vulnerability as a new mother to force her into accepting whatever terms he offered. "Mrs. Pierce," Frank said quietly, "I need to ask you something important. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Family, friends, anywhere you can stay if you need to leave quickly?" Diana looked up from the devastating text messages. "You think I'm in danger. Not physical danger necessarily, but men like your husband don't like to lose control. When he realizes you know about his plans, he might try to accelerate his timeline or take steps to protect his assets that could leave you in a very difficult position." Diana thought about her situation. She had no job, no independent income, no assets in her name alone. Richard had been very effective in making her completely financially dependent on him. "I need to see a lawyer," she said. "Yes, you do. And Mrs. Pierce, you need to see one immediately, before your husband realizes what you know." Frank recommended an attorney who specialized in high-asset divorce cases, someone who could move quickly to protect Diana's financial interests. He also suggested she open a bank account in her name only and transfer some money there immediately, before Richard could empty their joint accounts. As Diana drove home with the evidence tucked securely in her purse, she felt like she was living in someone else's life. This morning she had been a woman with suspicions about her husband's fidelity. This afternoon she was a woman preparing for divorce while 8 months pregnant with the child of a man who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient obligation. But along with the devastation, Diana felt something else, a strange sense of relief. All the gaslighting and manipulation. All the times Richard had made her feel crazy for suspecting what her instincts told her was true. It was over. She knew the truth now, and the truth, however painful, was better than living in uncertainty and self-doubt. That evening, Richard came home with flowers and takeout from her favorite restaurant, just as he had the week before. Diana accepted his kisses and made conversation about her day. But now she understood his gestures for what they were: not expressions of love, but maintenance to keep her compliant until he was ready to discard her. "How was your day?" she asked as they ate dinner. "Busy. Several meetings about the new development project." Diana nodded and smiled, playing her part in their charade of a marriage. But inside, she was planning her own strategy. Tomorrow, she would call the lawyer Frank had recommended. She would open her own bank account. She would begin fighting back. Richard had underestimated her. assuming she would be too overwhelmed and dependent to protect herself and their child. He was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. As she went to bed that night, listening to Richard's satisfied breathing beside her, Diana whispered to her unborn baby, "Your daddy thinks mommy doesn't have any fight in her. He's going to learn otherwise." The law offices of Chen and Associates occupied an entire floor of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, a far cry from Frank Morrison's modest White Plains office. Diana felt intimidated as she sat in the waiting area, surrounded by expensive artwork and lawyers in $1,000 suits. Barbara Chen emerged from her office at exactly 10 o'clock, moving with the kind of crisp efficiency that suggested she billed by the minute. She was in her mid-40s with short black hair and the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that Diana imagined could dissect a lying husband's finances with surgical precision. "Mrs. Pierce, Frank Morrison filled me in on your situation. We need to move fast." Barbara's office was impressive but not ostentatious. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park, and the walls were lined with law books and framed degrees from Harvard and Columbia. Diana settled into a leather chair across from Barbara's desk, feeling like she was entering a battle and finally had a competent general. "First question," Barbara said, opening a legal pad. "Are you committed to ending this marriage, or are you hoping for reconciliation?" Diana thought about Richard's text messages, his cruel dismissal of her as the old wife, his plans to use her vulnerability against her. "I'm committed to protecting myself and my baby. If that means divorce, then yes." "Good. Ambivalence makes my job harder." Barbara made a note. "Second question, what are your financial goals? Revenge, security, or just getting out with dignity intact?" "Security," Diana answered without hesitation. "I want to make sure my child and I can survive without Richard. I don't care about revenge." Barbara smiled approvingly. "Also good. Revenge is expensive and emotionally exhausting. Security is achievable. Now, let's talk strategy." Barbara explained the process with the same methodical approach she probably used for all her cases. But Diana could see the lawyer's genuine anger at Richard's calculated cruelty. Abandoning a pregnant wife was bad enough, but the systematic financial manipulation Barbara described as they reviewed Frank's evidence clearly offended her professional ethics. "Your husband has been very careful," Barbara said, spreading financial documents across her desk. "Moving money, creating corporate entities, transferring assets. But he's made some mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "He's been sloppy about covering his tracks, probably because he assumed you would never investigate him. And New York is an equitable distribution state, which means you're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, regardless of whose name is on the account." Barbara outlined their strategy: immediately freeze all joint accounts to prevent Richard from moving more money, file for temporary spousal support to ensure Diana had living expenses during the divorce proceedings, and begin the process of identifying and valuing all marital assets. "The challenge," Barbara continued, "is that your husband will fight this. Men like Richard Pierce don't give up their money easily, and they especially don't like being caught. He's going to claim you're mentally unstable, that pregnancy has made you paranoid and irrational." Diana thought about Richard's gaslighting tactics, his efforts to make her doubt her own perceptions. He's already started that narrative, which is why we need to establish your competence and stability immediately. I'm going to refer you to a psychiatrist who can evaluate your mental state and provide expert testimony if needed. We're also going to document everything, every conversation, every interaction, every attempt at manipulation. Barbara's assistant brought in more files, and Diana realized the scope of what they were undertaking. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a comprehensive investigation into Richard's business practices and financial arrangements. "There's something else we need to discuss," Barbara said, her tone becoming more serious. "Your husband's relationship with Scarlett Stevens isn't just an affair. Based on the financial transfers and corporate arrangements, she's essentially his kept woman. That suggests this relationship is more serious than a midlife crisis fling." Diana absorbed this information, though it no longer shocked her the way it would have a week ago. What does that mean for the divorce? It means Richard has been planning this for a long time, and he's invested significant emotional and financial resources in his future with Ms. Stevens. Men in his position don't usually make those kinds of investments unless they're planning to marry the other woman. The thought of Richard marrying Scarlett, of her replacement becoming the new Mrs. Pierce, sent a wave of unexpected grief through Diana. Not because she wanted to save her marriage, that was clearly impossible, but because it represented the final death of everything she had believed about her life. "How long will this take?" Diana asked. "Complex financial cases like this can take a year or more, but we can get temporary orders in place within a few weeks. The key is to establish your rights and protect your assets before your husband realizes what's happening." Barbara handed Diana a list of documents to gather tax returns, bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, property deeds, corporate records for Pierce Development. Diana's head spun as she realized how much of their financial life Richard had kept hidden from her. "I don't have access to most of these," Diana admitted. "Then we'll subpoena them. Your husband can't hide assets from the court, though he'll certainly try." Barbara's smile was sharp and predatory. "Mrs. Pierce, your husband clearly believes he's smarter than everyone around him. That kind of arrogance is often a lawyer's best friend." They discussed practical matters. Diana would need to open her own bank account immediately and transfer money for living expenses before Richard could freeze their accounts. She would need to change her beneficiaries on life insurance policies and update her will. Most importantly, she would need to continue acting normally at home until they were ready to serve Richard with divorce papers. "How much time do I have?" Diana asked. "Based on the text messages Frank showed me, your husband is planning to file for divorce shortly after your baby is born. That gives us about 3 weeks to get everything in place." Barbara checked her calendar. "I want to serve him simultaneously with divorce papers and motions to freeze assets. Strike hard and fast before he knows what hit him." Diana left the law office feeling empowered for the first time in months. She had professional advocates now, people who understood Richard's tactics and knew how to counter them. She wasn't a helpless victim anymore. She was a client with rights and resources. Her first stop was the bank, where she opened a savings account in her name only and transferred $10,000 from their joint checking account. It felt like stealing from her own life. But Barbara had been clear Diana needed independent access to money for the legal battle ahead. Next, she drove to a public library in a town where no one would recognize her and used their computers to research divorce law and financial planning for single mothers. Knowledge was power, and Diana was determined to understand every aspect of what she was facing. That evening, Richard came home in an unusually good mood, whistling as he sorted through his mail and chatted about his day. Diana wondered if he had spent the afternoon with Scarlett, making plans for their future together while his pregnant wife prepared for war. "You seem happy," Diana observed over dinner. "Just a good day at work. Several deals are coming together nicely." Richard reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "How are you feeling, baby? Giving you trouble?" Diana managed to smile and make appropriate conversation, but she was studying Richard's face, looking for tells and patterns she had missed before. His happiness felt genuine, which meant he had no idea what she had spent the day doing. His confidence in his control over her was absolute. "Richard," she said carefully, "what happens if something happens to you? Do I know enough about our finances to manage on my own?" Richard's expression flickered with something, annoyance, suspicion, before returning to its pleasant mask. "Why would you worry about something like that? Nothing's going to happen to me." "I know, but with the baby coming, I've been thinking about practical things. What if you're in an accident or get sick? I don't even know the passwords to our accounts." "Diana, you don't need to worry about that stuff. That's my job." Richard's voice carried a slight edge now. "Your job is to focus on having a healthy baby. Let me handle everything else." There it was, the dismissal, the infantilization, the insistence that she remained dependent and ignorant. But now Diana recognized it for what it was: not protection, but control. "Of course," she said, smiling sweetly. "I just want to make sure our baby is protected." "Our baby will be fine," Richard said firmly. I'll make sure of that. As Diana went to bed that night, she reflected on Richard's words. He would make sure their baby was fine, but what about Diana herself? His text messages made it clear that he saw her as an obligation to be minimized. Not a person deserving of security and respect. But Richard had underestimated her. In 3 weeks, when he expected to find a compliant, overwhelmed new mother ready to accept whatever scraps he offered, he would instead find a woman armed with legal representation and a complete understanding of their financial situation. Diana placed her hand on her belly and felt the baby's strong kicks. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "Mama's got this handled." Diana had been having trouble sleeping, a combination of late pregnancy discomfort and the stress of preparing for legal war while pretending everything was normal. She had gotten up for her third trip to the bathroom of the night when she heard Richard's voice coming from his home office. It was nearly midnight, unusually late even for his mysterious phone calls. Diana paused in the hallway, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The office door was slightly ajar, probably because Richard thought she was sound asleep. "The baby's due in 3 weeks," she heard Richard say, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet house. "I'll file for divorce the day after she gives birth." Diana's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the wall outside the office, straining to hear every word. "Diana's completely dependent on me," Richard continued. "She'll take whatever I offer because she won't have any choice. No job, no money, no family who can support her, and a baby." Diana's heart hammered so loudly she was afraid Richard would hear it. She placed one hand on her belly to steady herself and leaned closer to the door. "I've been very careful about moving the assets," Richard said. "By the time she realizes what's happening, most of the money will be protected in accounts she can't touch." There was a pause, and Diana realized he was listening to someone else, presumably Scarlett, based on what she had learned from the private investigator. "She's not going to fight back," Richard said with a laugh that chilled Diana to the bone. 22 years of marriage taught me that Diana doesn't have the spine for confrontation. She'll cry and beg and eventually accept whatever terms I give her." Another pause. Then Richard's voice became warmer, more intimate. "Don't worry, baby. After the divorce is final, we can get married properly. Our child will grow up with both parents, and Diana's kid, well, that's not really my problem anymore." Diana had to grip the wall to keep from collapsing. Richard was planning to abandon not just her, but their unborn child. The baby she had waited so long for, that had taken years of fertility treatments and heartbreak to conceive, was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. "What if she suspects something?" a female voice asked, even through the phone speaker. Diana could hear Scarlett's southern accent. She might have some vague suspicions, but Diana's not smart enough to do anything about it. Richard replied, "She's been playing the role of dependent housewife for so long. She's forgotten how to think for herself." The casual cruelty of his words hit Diana like physical blows. This was how her husband really saw her, not as a partner or equal, but as a pathetic dependent who could be easily manipulated and discarded. "I can't wait much longer," Scarlett said. "The baby's growing, and I want to be married before she's born." "Soon, sweetheart. Just a few more weeks, and then we can start our real life together." Diana had heard enough. She crept back to the bedroom as quietly as she could, her mind reeling with fury and determination. Richard thought she was too weak and stupid to fight back. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was, but first, she needed to be smart about this. Barbara Chen had warned her not to reveal what she knew until they were ready to strike. Diana had to continue the pretense of being the oblivious wife while preparing her counterattack. She climbed back into bed and lay still, listening to Richard's continued conversation with his mistress. They were discussing their future home, their plans for raising Scarlett's child, even potential names for the baby. It was a complete life that had no room for Diana or her child. When Richard finally came to bed an hour later, Diana pretended to be asleep. He settled beside her with a satisfied sigh, probably pleased with his progress toward his new life. Diana wanted to scream at him, to confront him with everything she had overheard, but she forced herself to remain still and silent. The next morning, Diana called Barbara Chen as soon as Richard left for work. "He's planning to file for divorce the day after I give birth," Diana said without preamble. "That's actually good news for us," Barbara replied. "It shows premeditation and calculated cruelty. A judge will not look kindly on a man who abandons his wife and newborn child." Diana recounted the entire conversation she had overheard, including Richard's dismissive comments about her intelligence and spine. Barbara took detailed notes, already planning how to use Richard's words against him. "Mrs. Pierce, I'm going to ask you to do something difficult," Barbara said. "I want you to record your husband if he has any more of these conversations. New York is a one-party consent state, which means you can legally record conversations you're part of or overhear in your own home. You want me to spy on him? I want you to document his intent to defraud you and abandon your child. Those recordings could be crucial evidence in court." Diana agreed, though the thought of actively gathering evidence against her husband felt surreal. 3 weeks ago, she had been planning nursery decorations and baby names. Now she was preparing to record conversations for a divorce trial. That evening, Richard came home with an expensive bottle of wine and Diana's favorite chocolates. "What's the occasion?" Diana asked. Though she could guess, Richard was celebrating the approach of his freedom. "Can't a man spoil his beautiful pregnant wife?" Richard said, kissing her cheek. The gesture that once would have made her feel loved now felt like mockery. During dinner, Diana asked casual questions about Richard's work, his plans for the coming weeks, his thoughts about the baby's arrival. Richard answered with the smooth lies she now recognized, painting a picture of a devoted husband and father-to-be while planning his escape. "I've been thinking about taking some time off after the baby's born," Richard said. "Maybe we could go somewhere warm for a vacation when you're feeling up for travel." Diana nodded and smiled, playing her part perfectly. But inside, she was marveling at his ability to lie so smoothly. He had no intention of taking time off for their baby or going on vacation with Diana. He was planning to file for divorce and start his new life with Scarlett. After dinner, Richard retreated to his office for his nightly phone calls. Diana positioned herself in the hallway with the recording app open on her phone, documenting every cruel word and heartless plan. Over the next few days, she gathered hours of recordings, Richard discussing his financial hiding strategies with his lawyer, Richard and Scarlett making plans for their life together, Richard laughing about Diana's gullibility and dependence. Each recording was another nail in the coffin of their marriage, but also another piece of evidence for Diana's legal team. Richard's own words would be used to ensure Diana and their child receive fair treatment in the divorce. As she listened to her husband plot her abandonment, Diana felt a strange sense of liberation. The woman Richard described in his phone calls, weak, dependent, lacking in intelligence and spine, was a fictional character he had created to justify his betrayal. The real Diana was proving to be much stronger and smarter than he had ever imagined. The baby kicked vigorously, as if responding to her mother's determination. Diana placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "We're going to be just fine. Little one, better than fine." Richard had made the mistake of underestimating his opponent. By the time he realized his error, it would be too late to change the outcome. Diana smiled as she prepared for bed, listening to Richard finish his final phone call of the evening. Tomorrow, she would deliver the recordings to Barbara Chen, and they would finalize their strategy for the confrontation to come. Richard Pierce thought he was playing chess while his wife played checkers. He was about to discover that Diana had been playing chess all along. She had just been letting him think he was winning. The morning of the confrontation dawned gray and cold, matching Diana's mood as she prepared for the most important performance of her life. Barbara Chen had scheduled everything with military precision. The process server would arrive at exactly 9 a.m. The motions to freeze assets would be filed simultaneously, and Diana would be ready with her recordings and evidence. Diana stood at the bedroom window, watching the circular driveway as she had every morning for 22 years. But today would be the last time she woke up as Richard's unsuspecting wife. By noon, everything would be different. Richard was downstairs in the kitchen, reading his newspaper and drinking coffee from the mug that had survived when Diana's had shattered 3 weeks ago. He seemed relaxed, probably anticipating another day of secret meetings with Scarlett, while his pregnant wife remained safely ignorant at home. At exactly 9 o'clock, Diana heard the doorbell ring. She positioned herself at the top of the stairs, giving her a clear view of the foyer while remaining out of sight. Richard Pierce. The process server was a middle-aged woman in a professional suit, carrying a leather portfolio. "Yes," Richard answered, his voice carrying the slight irritation he always showed toward unexpected interruptions. "You're being served with legal papers. Please sign here to acknowledge receipt." Diana watched Richard's face change as he realized what was happening. Confusion gave way to alarm as he scanned the documents. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice rising with each word he read. The process server maintained her professional demeanor. Divorce petition, motion for temporary spousal support, motion to freeze marital assets, and subpoenas for financial records. "Have a good day, sir." Richard stood frozen in the doorway, papers in his hands, as the process server returned to her car. Diana could see his mind working, trying to process this unexpected development. She walked down the stairs slowly, her hand on the railing for support. Richard looked up at her approach, his face a mixture of shock and growing rage. "Diana, what the hell is this?" "It's me having a spine." "Richard," Diana said, her voice steady and clear. "Something you said I lacked." Richard's face went white as he realized she had overheard his phone conversations. "You were listening to my private calls. In my own house, yes, I was." Diana reached the bottom of the stairs and faced her husband directly. "I know about Scarlett. I know about the baby. I know about the money you've been hiding." Richard's shock was giving way to the familiar anger Diana had learned to fear over the years. But today, his rage didn't intimidate her. She had legal protection now, and more importantly, she had the truth. "You don't know what you're doing," Richard said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he used when trying to manipulate her. "You're 8 months pregnant and not thinking clearly. We can work this out without lawyers and courts." "Work it out how?" "Richard, the way you planned to work it out by filing for divorce the day after I gave birth." Richard's jaw tightened as he realized how much she knew. "Diana, you're being dramatic. I never said—" "I have recordings," Diana interrupted, pulling out her phone. "Hours of recordings of you planning to abandon your pregnant wife and unborn child. Would you like to hear them?" She pressed play on one of the most damaging conversations, Richard's voice filling the foyer. "Diana's not smart enough to do anything about it. She's been playing the role of dependent housewife for so long. She's forgotten how to think for herself." Richard lunged for the phone, but Diana stepped back quickly. "There are copies. Richard, my lawyer has everything." "Your lawyer?" Richard's voice cracked with disbelief. "Diana, you can't afford a lawyer? You don't have any money?" Diana smiled, an expression she had never used with her husband before. Cold, knowing, victorious. "I have half of everything we own. Richard, including the $200,000 you spent on your mistress." The front door opened again, and Scarlett Stevens walked in without knocking. She was even more beautiful in person than in the surveillance photos, her red hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows. But her face showed confusion and concern as she took in the scene before her. "Richard, what's going on? You said to meet you here at—" Scarlett stopped mid-sentence as she saw the legal papers in Richard's hands. "Perfect timing," Diana said calmly. "You must be Scarlett. I'm Diana, Richard's wife, the one he was planning to divorce right after I gave birth." Scarlett's face went pale as she realized what was happening. "Richard, you said she didn't know anything. You said she was clueless." "She was supposed to be," Richard snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "Diana, this is insane. You can't just destroy our marriage over some misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Diana's voice rose for the first time. "You got matching tattoos with your pregnant mistress while I was carrying your child. You spent our savings on another woman. You planned to abandon me the day after I gave birth. The baby kicked violently in response to Diana's elevated emotion, and she placed both hands on her belly, taking deep breaths to calm herself. Richard told me you were mentally unstable, Scarlett said, her southern accent more pronounced under stress. He said the pregnancy made you paranoid and jealous. Diana laughed, a sound with no humor in it. He told you I was mentally unstable. Did he also tell you he's been married to me for 22 years? Did he mention that this baby was conceived through fertility treatments that took 3 years and cost $50,000? Scarlett looked at Richard with dawning understanding. You said you'd been separated for months. You said the marriage was already over. More lies, Diana said. Richard's very good at telling people what they want to hear, but I have bank records showing he's been supporting you, while telling me we needed to cut expenses for the baby. I have recordings of him calling me the old wife and discussing how to minimize his financial obligations to his own child. Richard's face was red with fury and humiliation. Enough, Diana. You're going to regret this. I'll make sure you get nothing in the divorce. I'll prove you're an unfit mother. With what evidence? Diana asked calmly. My college degree, my teaching career that you convinced me to give up, my complete dedication to our marriage and fertility treatments, my careful management of our household and social obligations for 2 decades. She pulled out another document from the legal papers. Or maybe you'll use this psychiatric evaluation that confirms I'm completely mentally competent and emotionally stable. My lawyer was very thorough. Richard snatched the document and read it quickly, his face growing darker with each paragraph. The psychiatrist Barbara had referred Diana to had not only confirmed her mental competence, but had noted signs of emotional abuse and financial control in her marriage. You think you're so smart, Richard said, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone Diana had learned to fear. But you have no idea what you're up against. I'll destroy you in court. I'll make sure you end up with nothing. For the first time in 22 years, Richard's threats didn't frighten Diana. You can try, she said quietly, but I have something you don't expect me to have. What's that? A spine. The very thing you said I lacked. Diana walked to the front door and opened it wide. I think it's time for both of you to leave. This is my house too, Richard, and I don't want you here right now. Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but Scarlett was already moving toward the door. The reality of the situation was sinking in for her. Richard had lied about everything, and she was now connected to a man facing a nasty, public divorce. This isn't over, Diana, Richard said as he grabbed his keys from the hall table. You're right, Diana replied. It's just beginning. But Richard, next time you underestimate someone, remember this moment. Richard and Scarlett left together, their voices raised in argument before they even reached the driveway. Diana closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her heart racing but her mind clear. She was alone in the house that had been both her prison and her palace for 22 years. But for the first time in decades, she was truly free. Free from lies, free from manipulation, free from pretending she didn't know what she knew. The baby kicked gently, as if celebrating with her mother. Diana placed both hands on her belly and smiled, a real smile, full of genuine joy and anticipation. Just you and me now, little one, she whispered, and we're going to be just fine. Outside, she could hear Richard's BMW roaring out of the driveway, carrying him away from the life he had tried to abandon secretly and toward an uncertain future, with a woman who now knew he was capable of elaborate deception. Diana walked to the kitchen and began cleaning up from breakfast, humming softly as she worked. She had a divorce to fight, a baby to prepare for, and a new life to build. But for the first time in months, she felt equal to the challenges ahead. Richard Pierce had spent 22 years believing he was smarter than his wife. Today, he had learned the difference between intelligence and wisdom, between manipulation and strength. And Diana had learned that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. 6 months later, the sound of Emma Rose Pierce crying from her nursery pulled Diana from the light sleep she had finally learned to catch between feedings. At 51 years old, she was discovering that new motherhood was even more exhausting than she had expected, but also more rewarding than she had ever dreamed. "Coming, sweetheart," Diana called softly as she padded down the hallway of her new apartment. The two-bedroom condo in a family-friendly complex was a far cry from the Westchester mansion, but it felt more like home than any place Diana had lived in years. She had decorated it herself, choosing warm colors and comfortable furniture instead of the sterile elegance Richard had preferred. Emma's nursery was painted a soft lavender, with white furniture and a mobile of dancing stars that cast gentle shadows on the walls. Diana had assembled the crib herself, something she never would have attempted during her marriage, when Richard handled all such tasks while making her feel incompetent. "What's wrong, little love?" Diana asked as she lifted Emma from her crib. The baby settled immediately in her mother's arms, her crying replaced by contented gurgling. At 6 months old, Emma had Diana's dark hair and intelligent eyes, but thankfully none of Richard's features. Diana was grateful for that. She wanted no physical reminders of her daughter's father, who had shown no interest in his child since the divorce was finalized. Diana settled into the rocking chair she had bought with her own money, a phrase that still gave her a thrill of independence. The financial settlement had been better than she had dared hope, thanks to Barbara Chen's brilliant legal strategy and Richard's own recorded words used against him in court. "Tell me about your day, Emma," Diana said as she fed her daughter. It was a ritual they had developed, Diana talking through her daily activities as if Emma could understand every word. The truth was, Diana's days were fuller and more satisfying than they had been in years. She had returned to teaching, taking a position at the local community college that offered flexible hours and on-site childcare. After 20 years away from the classroom, she had worried about her ability to connect with students, but her fears had been unfounded. Her course on financial literacy for women had a waiting list every semester. Diana taught women from all backgrounds how to understand budgets, investments, and legal rights, skills she wished she had maintained during her marriage instead of delegating everything to Richard. "Mrs. Pierce really gets it," she had overheard one student tell another. "She knows what it's like to have someone else control your money. She makes us feel like we can learn this stuff." The irony wasn't lost on Diana that her greatest professional success had grown from her personal disaster. The skills she was teaching, financial independence, recognizing narcissistic abuse patterns, building support networks, were lessons she had learned the hard way. Emma finished eating and dozed in Diana's arms. Tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb. These quiet moments were Diana's favorite part of each day, when the apartment was peaceful and she could reflect on how completely her life had changed. The divorce had been ugly, as Barbara had predicted. Richard had fought every motion, claimed Diana was mentally unstable, and tried to paint himself as the victim of a vindictive wife. But his own recorded words had undermined every argument, and the judge had been particularly unimpressed with a man who planned to abandon his pregnant wife. The final settlement had given Diana half of all marital assets, including the Westchester house, which she had immediately sold. The money had allowed her to buy her condo outright, establish a college fund for Emma, and maintain financial security while building her new career. Richard had been ordered to pay substantial child support, though he had never once asked to see Emma or shown any interest in being a father. Diana was oddly grateful for his indifference. She had no desire to co-parent with a man who saw their daughter as an inconvenience. "Your daddy made his choice," Diana whispered to Emma, "but we're better off without someone who doesn't want to be here." Scarlett Stevens had disappeared from Richard's life within weeks of the divorce filing, apparently uninterested in staying with a man facing financial consequences and public humiliation. Diana had heard through Maureen's network of divorced women that Richard was now dating a series of younger women, but hadn't settled into another serious relationship. "Good," Maureen had said when she shared this gossip during one of their weekly coffee dates. "Maybe he'll finally understand what it feels like to be disposable." Diana put Emma back in her crib and returned to her own bedroom, where she found her laptop open to her doctoral dissertation. At 51, she had decided to pursue the PhD in education she had always wanted, focusing her research on financial literacy programs for women in transition. The work was challenging but fulfilling in ways Diana had forgotten were possible. For 22 years, she had defined herself through Richard's achievements and needs. Now, for the first time since college, she was building something entirely her own. A soft knock on the front door interrupted her writing. Diana checked the peephole and smiled as she saw Maureen standing in the hallway with 2 coffee cups and a bag from the local bakery. "Emergency chocolate croissant," Maureen announced as Diana opened the door. "I figured you might need sustenance after your late night with Emma." "How did you know she was up late?" Diana asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Because I know the look of a sleep-deprived mom, and you have it." Maureen settled onto Diana's couch with the familiarity of a best friend. "Besides, I brought supplies for a reason." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, eating pastries and watching the morning sun stream through Diana's windows. Their friendship had deepened since the divorce, built on shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild life after a failed marriage. "How's the dissertation coming?" Maureen asked. "Better than I expected. Turns out I have a lot to say about women and money." Diana laughed. "Who would have thought that my disaster of a marriage would become the foundation for a doctoral degree?" "I would have," Maureen said firmly. "Diana, you've always been brilliant. Richard just spent 20 years convincing you otherwise." It was true, though Diana was still learning to believe it. The woman who had once been afraid to balance a checkbook without Richard's approval was now teaching financial planning to dozens of students and conducting research that might influence policy. "I got a call from a publisher yesterday," Diana said, trying to keep her voice casual. "They want me to write a book about financial independence for women in abusive relationships." Maureen nearly choked on her coffee. "Diana, that's incredible. Are you going to do it?" "I think so. The advance would help with Emma's college fund, and maybe the book could help other women avoid what I went through." Diana thought about the women in her classes, many of whom shared stories similar to her own. Husbands who controlled finances, who made their wives feel stupid about money, who used financial dependence as a tool of control. If her experience could help even one woman recognize those patterns earlier, the public exposure would be worth it. Emma's cry from the nursery interrupted their conversation. Diana started to get up, but Maureen waved her back down. "Let Aunt Maureen handle this one," she said, heading toward the nursery. "You finish your coffee while it's still hot." Diana listened to Maureen's voice cooing to Emma, offering the kind of support she had never expected to need, but was grateful to have. Her support network had grown tremendously since the divorce. Other single mothers, divorced women, her students, her colleagues at the college. She had learned that Richard's isolation tactics had been more effective than she realized. For years, she had believed she had no one to turn to. But the truth was that people had been there all along. She just hadn't been allowed to see them. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Barbara Chen. "Final child support payment processed. You're officially financially independent." Diana smiled at the message. The phrase that had once terrified her, financial independence, now felt like victory. She was supporting herself and Emma through her own work, building a career that gave her purpose beyond being someone's wife. Maureen returned with Emma, who was now wide awake and ready to play. "She has your eyes," Maureen said, settling back onto the couch with the baby. "And thank God, none of Richard's personality. She's going to grow up knowing she can take care of herself," Diana said firmly. "I'm going to make sure of that." As if understanding her mother's words, Emma gurgled and reached for Diana's face with chubby fingers. Diana caught her daughter's hand and kissed the tiny palm. "That's right, baby girl. We're going to teach you to be strong and smart and independent. You'll never have to depend on someone else to know your own worth." Akram. The afternoon passed quickly as Maureen helped with Emma, while Diana worked on her dissertation. It was a routine they had developed, the practical support of women helping women. The kind of mutual aid that Diana was learning was more reliable than any marriage vow. As evening approached and Maureen prepared to leave, Diana reflected on how different her life was from what she had expected a year ago. She had lost a marriage, but gained herself. She had lost financial security based on someone else's success, but built her own career and independence. Most importantly, she had gained Emma, not just a daughter, but proof that she was capable of creating and nurturing life on her own terms. "Same time next week?" Maureen asked as she gathered her things. "Absolutely. And Maureen, thank you for everything." "That's what friends are for," Maureen replied, hugging Diana goodbye. "Besides, you did all the hard work. I just brought coffee and moral support." After Maureen left, Diana gave Emma her evening bath and prepared for their nighttime routine. As she read bedtime stories in the lavender nursery, Diana thought about the future she was building for both of them. Emma would grow up in a home without secrets, without manipulation, without the constant tension that had characterized Diana's marriage. She would see her mother working, achieving, making independent decisions. She would learn that women could be complete on their own, that love should add to life rather than control it. Once upon a time, Diana read from Emma's favorite book, there was a brave princess who saved herself. The story had always been Emma's favorite, and Diana suspected she knew why. Children absorbed more than adults realized, and Emma was growing up in a home where women's strength was celebrated rather than suppressed. As Diana tucked Emma into her crib and turned on the Star Mobile, she whispered the same words she said every night. "Sweet dreams, little love. Tomorrow we'll have another adventure together." Diana returned to her bedroom and opened her laptop to continue writing. Her dissertation chapter on economic abuse was nearly finished, and she wanted to capture her thoughts while they were fresh. Financial control serves as both a method of abuse and a barrier to leaving abusive relationships, she typed. When women are systematically excluded from financial decision-making and kept ignorant of family assets, they become trapped not by love, but by practical necessity. The words flowed easily, informed by personal experience, but grounded in academic research. Diana was learning to transform her pain into purpose, her mistakes into lessons that could help others. A year ago, she had been a woman whose greatest fear was being left alone. Now, she was a woman who had learned that being alone was preferable to being with someone who diminished her worth. Diana had discovered something Richard had never understood. True security didn't come from depending on someone else's success, but from building strength and competence within herself. As she worked late into the night, Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, Diana smiled at the life she had created from the ashes of her marriage. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was better than anything she had dared imagine. Richard had tried to write her story for her, casting her as the dependent wife who would gratefully accept whatever scraps he offered. Instead, Diana had written her own ending, one where the woman who was supposed to be too weak and stupid to fight back had built a life more fulfilling than anything her marriage had provided. Some scratches, Diana reflected as she typed, reveal more than surface wounds. Sometimes they reveal the strength you never knew you had, waiting beneath the surface for the right moment to emerge. And sometimes, those moments of revelation become the foundation for a completely new story, one where the woman saves herself and teaches her daughter to do the same.